So hopefully you can hear me, and thank you. Thank you to the speakers who went before me, especially Eben. That was super great to hear your thoughts. I'm here to talk about 30 years of digital signage and what have we learned or learnt. So I'm going to begin with a little video. And the question is, what did you just see? So this actually was made, there was a product for the Magnavox Odyssey 2, which was, in Europe was the Philips Video Pack home gaming system. It was called Newscaster in Europe. It was called Keyboard Creations in North America. And it really was an early digital signage product. So this is what digital signage looks like in 1978 with accessible hardware and software. Thanks to the wonders of emulation, and that's also obviously the emulation community and the Raspberry Pi community have a significant overlap as well. I was able to run that software in an emulator and therefore not have to have figured out 40 years ago that I would be talking here today. So that's one example of the early days of signage. Now if we go and say, well, what does a modern pitch look like? You can see that here's an example of a modern marketing pitch for digital signage, which is to help you create attractive moving displays to enable the user to generate eye-catching displays, making full use of movement and other special effects. We want to enable non-programmers to use it. After all, the user may be a shopkeeper or a restaurateur. So this is from 1982 for the Sinclair ZX81. And actually, I thought for sure I would be the only person today to show a audio cassette on their deck, but I'm the second person today to do so. So in terms of the prehistory of signage, really there are origins that are quite a bit older than I realized, and I happen to have made a connection with the gentleman by the name of Marvin Drogsma, who actually is a fan and historian of ancient digital signage. So he was able to help me out with some of that stuff, so thanks to him. So on to Scala. So I worked at Commodore for about 5 years from 1989 to 1993, and then I moved over to Scala. But Scala's history started in 1987 in Oslo, Norway, and a gentleman by the name of Jon Böhmer, who some of you who have been here a while may actually know. When he was about 20, he started a company, and he had the idea of using the sort of unique ability of the Amiga, which was to produce nice motion graphics in a TV-compatible way and find a useful application for it. And so his spirit was very much not, hey, let's shove technology at problems, but really looking at problems. So quite a mature point of view for someone who was so young, and that's his official headshot from the early days that I scanned from some old printed material. There's an earlier photograph, which is him with Stig Pedersheim, who was the first software developer. That's in his bedroom in Norway. So that's kind of the equivalent of our Apple garage. And another interesting early tale, and I won't get too nostalgic because this is really not so much about the company, but when the company was founded, it was done from a very small amount of seed money, but at a certain point, he needed more money, and his father put up the family chicken farm as collateral, and that is really kind of our humble origin as well, that we came from such an unusual and humble place. And so if we look at one early example, so this is a hotel information channel from 1991, I believe, in the SAS Scandinavian Hotel in Oslo, and a number of different screens. So the hotel obviously wanted to be able to communicate with their customers. They have something like 500 rooms. The hardware infrastructure largely being in place with the TVs already being bought or leased. The early people in the company, including Yun, saw the opportunity to apply this technology and apply these concepts into markets like hotel TV, and they also sold the cable TV channels. And I remember one of my early trips to Norway being jet lagged and up at 3 in the morning and channel flipping through all 13 channels that existed at the time, and about 7 of them were running Scala at 3 in the morning in one form or another, whether it was the local TV channel was using it for weather or other information, or the hotel itself. And so really I think the lesson from this is that you can take something new and actually make business out of it if you can deliver it in a way that really resonates with the need and is easy to use. So in those days we had a pretty precise view. This was before I was working there, we had a pretty precise view of what we were trying to solve, and that made it possible to solve it by listening to that customer and by targeting what we were doing for what they actually needed. Let's have a quick tour through some other early applications. So this is 1992. This is convenience store TV in an Esso station in Norway, and we had probably a few dozen locations for that network. Classic CRT tubes before the LCD, which obviously flat screens was a big transformation in our industry because of the ease of placement compared to having to hang a monstrosity like that. Another example was quite interesting was the Adam and Eva shopping mall. So this was a fashion shopping center in Stockholm, Sweden, and they were using motion video and other animated graphics to kind of promote the brand, and some of the merchants had advertising on it as well. And then I wasn't able to find color pictures from this one, but I have some black and white scans. I believe the screens were color, you never know. Which was early television at McDonald's. And that was actually a project in the UK. I know Chiswick was one of the locations that was used. There were about 10 or 15 locations of that, and it was just basically rolling advertising. So very early quick service restaurant stuff. So as much as the industry was not a real industry in terms of conferences and established identities, and the term digital signage probably hadn't been tossed around yet, already we started to see, on the one hand, being pulled into a lot of different applications, on the other hand, sort of the emergence of a lot of key markets that are still strong markets today. This is another interesting and early example, so also 1992. So this was a kiosk that we did for Renault that was in both Belgium and France, so it was a multilingual project. There were about 20 dealers that had it hooked up. You could browse the cars that were available. It doesn't quite look like a modern Hyundai dealership that we saw earlier this morning, but this was early days of touchscreen interactivity, early days of car configurators. And what we learned from this project was that one of the main users of this was actually salespeople coming up to speed on all the ins and outs of the product. And so I think the lesson there is sometimes the important users aren't necessarily the users that you anticipate. And in 2015, so that's 23 years later, we did a project for Ford. So Ford launched their new F-150 pickup truck, and the major technical innovation in that truck was they replaced almost all the steel with aluminum, made the truck much lighter, and that was good for fuel economy, and it was a huge project. They had to retrain all their dealers, provide them new equipment, rekit all the factories. And what they were facing was customer education. We don't want to lose the reputation of Ford as a solid, tough truck because we've gone with a metal that doesn't have the image of steel, man of steel and steel being strong, but the aluminum trucks are still incredibly strong. So they commissioned a digital signage kiosk with a bunch of additional features where you could actually see and touch the metal to tell the story, to explain the technical innovations that went into it, and as well to be a car configurator. But it being 2.5 decades later, we actually have analytics on it, and guess what we saw? Same thing, which is in the 15 minutes prior to the dealership opening, there's a spike in usage because the sales teams have a busy life and they're busy with customers, but they want to be able to know the product as well as their customers or better, and so they spend the time in the kiosk learning the ins and outs of the product. 1992 again, so Maastricht University Hospital opened. This was a huge deal. The Queen of the Netherlands actually did the ribbon cutting for this. And there was not only was there in-room and hallway TV, but there was an interactive kiosk that had information and wayfinding. And the hospital said, when they did their surveys, 80% of the patients and visitors got some information from the interactive kiosks or from the signage. And what's interesting about this is if you look at the screenshot in the upper right, you'll see that there's a silhouette of a hand. And that's because 1992, people weren't used to interacting with touchscreen kiosks, and so there's a certain amount of education that is needed to bring people from their expectation to the new expectation. And that speaks as well to how far can you carry someone from the unfamiliar to the familiar. So this is a small step at which you can do. And actually, I think it was Tom Nix that told me the story that I guess it was his son when he was about 4 years old, went up to the TV in the family room and tried to pinch zoom the TV and said, "Dad, the TV's broken." So in the interim between this, where we have to teach people to use a touchscreen, and what kids are basically born with today, we have a complete inversion of the expectation and a removal of the training. So now we're training people about putting on VR goggles, for better or for worse, but the idea of what's intuitive changes over time, and certainly there are major sort of game changer things that have happened in our industry, things like the iPhone, that have really changed the expectation of what people want to expect as a baseline out of an interactive experience. Jumping forward a little bit to the year 2000, so the Hubble Space Telescope has been in orbit for a long, long time, and because it's government funded, one of the sister organizations is a Space Science Telescope Institute, or Space Telescope Science Institute, and they have a public outreach mandate. And so one of the employees there said, we have all these great scientists that we work with, we have all these great visual materials and information that's coming. What we should do is curate this into a program which we can then make available for free to science museums across the country and across the globe. And so ViewSpace was created, and actually ViewSpace originally was distributed on CD-ROMs and DVD-ROMs by the Post, and ultimately it became a networked digital signage solution after being a freestanding solution. The ViewSpace program runs, it varies, but it runs about 6 hours in duration. It's made up of relatively short segments. So in a science museum, you can walk in to a gallery that's got a screen and watch 1 or 2 or 5 segments as much as you want, but it's always being refreshed. So that 6 hours, maybe they turn over 5 or 10% of the programming every month. So you come back to the Science Center the next year and there's a lot of new information. And you can see here it's running on the dome of a planetarium. The middle picture actually is from Germany. The right picture is a pretty typical museum installation, Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Obviously the museums had a lot of different technologies at their disposal and not necessarily a lot of budget. So the idea that this was a live, ongoing exhibit was valuable to them, and then depending on the facilities that they had and the budget they had, they might put in a large projector screen or a large flat screen or use other projection facilities that they have. And really, I think the lesson there is that you can create a lot of value by paying attention to the content and keeping the content fresh. And at its peak, which is, I think is still pretty much there, it's over 200 planetariums are using this, or science museums. So Estee Lauder put a makeup kiosk in Macy's Herald Square in New York City. This was 2001, give or take. So the idea was that a patron would go in to be, see the products and get tests made up, and with a digital signage kiosk, the operator could effectively freeze frame the way they looked before and at various stages of the process. And then, I didn't knock out the other slide, so this was done. Anyway, there was a street-facing screen which had the before, during, and after. So that's basically what the 4 monitors were there. And the idea being that you could see from the outside what was happening, and that would encourage people to enter and experience it. So an early attempt as well at getting some degree of personalization that you could be part of the communication. Nedbank is a South African bank. This was a really interesting project that was done by one of our partners in South Africa. So early banking digital signage, so around 2003, maybe started a little bit before. They replaced an incumbent solution, so a homegrown solution, which wasn't working reliably. So a little bit to the point about security that we heard, that relying on everyone rolling their own only works up to a certain level of complexity, and what we're seeing in sort of threat profiles is that necessary complexity to be resilient is bigger than the average garage shop can create. And in much the same way, there were a lot of sort of early efforts at people doing their own digital signage that more or less got replaced by more experienced solutions. So the partner went and replaced that, and it was, I think, dial-up modem based, and then they went back to all the locations around South Africa to replace them with cellular modems, and then they did it one more time to replace them with satellite dishes. And so if you know anything about the size of South Africa and knowing that the banks were scattered across the land, that was 130,000 kilometers per trip, so 3 times around the country over the course of the life of that network is approximately the distance from the Earth to the Moon, which nicely ties back to the ViewSpace story. So again, I think the takeaway there is sometimes, particularly when you're coming at it from the technology point of view, the hard problems that you get aren't the hard problems that you expect. Here's some actually motion graphics from that network. So you can see, there are familiar elements. There are things in there that you're like, well, that clearly is a product of its time and space. And I guess that's fair. So this is, I'll let the video play a little bit. So this is an early project with real data integration for us. I mean, we did some before that, I'm sure, but 2004 round figure. So it's the Warner Movie World Park south of Madrid. And what they wanted was they wanted to have kiosks to support wayfinding with some interactive advertising on it, information on wait times, restaurant wait times, availability, and so on. And what we were able to achieve with one of our partners was to really embody the spirit of cartoons and superheroes and the themes of the park in an experience that actually matched that experience and didn't clash with it. So really supporting the values of the environment that you're in, being a consistent tone and message to the overall experience. We talk about experience design for digital, but really the park is the experience. We're just part of that. And so, the good news is it's a super fun experience to sort of subsume yourself to, but we have to do a rich and engaging job of being that. And you hear that in the sound design, you see that in the motion design, and really capture the spirit of the park. 2007, Miele wanted to talk to their customers in a different way. So the challenge if you're a manufacturer of white goods is that your products are typically scattered across the different departments of a department store, and there's no way to have an opportunity to have a direct message with your customers and speak to how, not necessarily how the pieces work together, but how they support your life goals together. And so Miele built an experience center in Vianen in the Netherlands. And you could go there and they would interview you or fill out a bit of information about your profile and what you're interested in, and they'd give you actually a leather folio with some brochures, but there was also, in those days, it was an iPod Touch that was then keyed into some internal GPS type system. So they knew where you were in the venue, and there were stovetops and ranges and coffee machines and vacuum cleaners and washing machines and things like that, and there were, I think, over 100 screens with 40 distinct channels of content that would be responsive to who you were, where you were in the store, in the experience center. When you went into the coffee section, obviously they were actually brewing coffee, so it smelled like coffee, but when you walked through the dryer drum-shaped hallway into the washing machine area, you would smell the smell of fresh linen, which was done through a scent generator, all of which was being managed through digital signage management software. So that's really a kind of IoT type application, even though no one used those words then. What really matters is, as far back as 2007, if not even farther back, people were talking about, we need to think about the customer's journey through our experience. We need to have more control over our brand and messaging. We need to adapt that to what the customer actually wants and know whether, for example, they're more likely to want a washing machine whose power efficiency is best, or maybe because they have a larger family, they're really concerned about how long it takes to do a load because they have a busy life and a lot of different loads. So there were a lot of different digital touch points of different kinds. It was a relatively hands-on environment in that there were plenty of people to help you with the experience. There was a different configuration they could run when they brought their dealers through, so they were able to repurpose the venue for dealer education, training, product introductions, social events, and so on. So again, the power of creating an immersive experiential environment. And if you look at sort of the modern problem of what e-commerce and the current economy is doing to retailers, and people are talking heavily about rich, engaging experiences, a lot of it started with experiences like this. So this is in our backyard in Philadelphia. This is the Comcast Tower. So Philadelphia, and now some other cities as well, have a bylaw that says a certain small percentage of the total cost of the building has to be devoted to publicly accessible art. So if you walk around downtown Philadelphia, there's a lot of sculpture. The style of the sculpture reflects the era in which the downtown core had its most vibrant growth. But when they built the Comcast building, they decided to take most of the set aside for art and spend it digitally. So they digitally enabled the lobby, and what you don't get out of this picture is, you can see in the hallways how the wood paneling has this kind of gridded appearance, and you can see the digital screen is quite bright, but if you actually were there in person, you wouldn't see that it was a screen because the quality of the screen was high enough, the intensity was well matched to the environment. You walked in, you thought you were in a building full of wood, and then this would happen. So you can see they're having a lot of fun with the wood gridding, digitizing it, and it really created a wow and surprise experience when suddenly these sort of whimsical and playful scenes would happen that use the grid matrix. And by the way, this was a Niles creative group. It's nothing to do with Scala other than it was close to our home. So, it stung a little bit that someone else got this great project, but it's wonderful to have in our backyard. We took lots of customers and friends there. But you can see that even the mullions are digitized, so it's not limited to just the rectangles. And so then they're able to do this takeovers with beautiful art. They had sports video, lots of very high quality professional shot things. And the basic idea was that these little digital vignettes would be spaced apart, 4 or 5 minutes of just the wood, and then 30 seconds of sort of wow video. And so really create a surprise experience for the traffic that's going through the building, and really take advantage of the fact that we can use digital to create a mood, to wow people, to amaze people, to create a sense of wonder. And so I think the sense of wonder is really the power of this example. It's really one of the most beautiful pieces of digital art. And now we see a lot more digital activation of lobbies. These sorts of things are becoming a little bit more common, but this is a fantastic early example. And again, not one I'm taking credit for, but it's just wonderful. This is a project that we did. So this was at the Vancouver Olympics. I think I can say that it was at the Olympics. I'm not sure. I did. So anyway, the Bell, which is a major Canadian phone company, wanted to create a sort of a welcoming pavilion. So they digitally activated that pavilion. And in addition to the screens on the wall that all make sense, we also had these gesture-activated kiosks. So they were using, I don't know if it was Leap controllers or some home-built controllers, so that you could interact with the kiosks with gestures, and the pillars themselves were lit, and the color would follow you around. So when it's crowded, of course, they're all going to be lit, but when you walk through there, the color would follow you. So again, playful interaction with the environment, early experiments, and how can we create an environment that is connected to you, right? I mean, you have your experiences from your smartphone, and you have your experiences from walking through spaces, and one of them is primarily digital, and one of them is primarily not. And what can you do? How do we explore how you can blend them? So it's a really interesting example of how you can, again, create some kind of multisensory experience. And in this case, since it was for a specific window of time, and it has more of a general characteristic than, let's say, I'm merchandising, there is creative freedom that you have that you might not have in a retail situation. But again, a lot of really interesting power and exploration there. This one is an example from a trade show, so I don't know that it ever made it live, but this is a 3D printed model of a Chevy Corvette. It's in 1/6 scale, so it's about, I don't know, 3 feet long. But they're using projection mapping so that you can use the car configurator to change on the fly this object that's right in front of you. It's just out of touch reach, the physical model of the car, and yet it really pops as a demo or as an experience. And it's right there in front of you, so what's happening is magic. So someone's really created legitimate magic here through the use of projection mapping, and then they're using, I guess these are Christie micro tiles, to create the landscape behind it. I don't know if the floor can be lit. It's not lit in this case, but the visual power of seeing something that's it's not abstract. It's real. It's physically real, and you get the result of what's going on. But the fact that it's so far beyond what we can understand, like what a layman would understand is possible, really created a very powerful and resonant experience. And so sort of the element of surprise and power and magicianship that goes into the best stage performances can be achieved on a modest scale. I mean, in terms of amount of space that would be needed, this sort of thing could totally work in a car dealership, and I look forward to seeing something along those lines as well. So I think the connection and immediacy is the big takeaway there. This one is one of our projects. So this is Taipei Stadium. It's a 120 meter by 20 meter digital display, and they had the idea that they could connect it socially. So the idea was that you could submit through an app on the phone, you could submit a picture or a short video. There was an approval process, obviously. They monetized this through ads in the app, and then it would send you a text message that would tell you when you can expect the video to play. Not only that, they would tell you what time you can expect it to be posted to the stadium's Facebook page where you could check it out. And they had a camera across the street so that you get like a picture of when your picture was posted. So, a great example of social integration with a destination venue being a stadium. So if you were a tourist, or if you were not attending a show or a game there, or if you were attending a game there, you could loop that in through the whole social interaction, and that was good for engagement, people feeling connected to the brand. Obviously, there are marketing and merchandising opportunities around that as well. So I think this is a really good example of how you can make something that's both big and personable. And in digital signage, one of the challenges is you get too personal at too big a scale. That doesn't work. And obviously the phone's a big part of the solution to that. We transact on our phone. We are happy to, up to a point, certain private information or personal information on the phone. When you go big and shared, obviously what you can do is curtailed. But in a scope like this, you can really go extremely big and still be fun and have a personal element. This is another non-Scala example. So this is the Oakley store in Manhattan. And what they've achieved here through the use of screens in the ceiling, and I should have the motion example. So a lot of very well curated visuals, but I think the big takeaway here is even in a constrained space with great design, you can do wonderful things. And so it's a little subtle in the picture, but each row of screens is actually slightly lower than the row in front of it. So it supports the illusion of depth of the store. It lets you see more of the picture when you're standing there and really take advantage of that. And definitely has kind of a wave feel to it when the graphics are wet. So I think the answer there is sensitivity to the space that you're designing for can drive a lot of good creative results. And that's 2015, so we're relatively current. This is two more non-Scala examples. So this is, actually it looks like a lawsuit title, Apple v. Microsoft. But it's Apple and Microsoft stores in New York City. So the Apple store is the one in the Oculus. This is one I find kind of unusual because as orderly as an Apple store is, they have these sort of haphazard seating cubes that really, to me, I've never seen anything that looks quite so random in an Apple store before, but that's their design. But what they've done is they have a very, very high quality video wall, and it's showing sort of hero videos of their products. But the video wall itself, although it's big, it's not dominating the store. I don't have a wide shot of this, but the video wall is significant, but it's not the store. But they're obviously doing pioneering work in retail, creating a great feeling when you're in the store, and they use digital to support that. Then you look at Microsoft, which has a lot of the same in-store objectives, which is to create a destination venue that's true to the brand that people are comfortable to explore. And they've chosen to light up a very large fraction of the surfaces in the store with digital. And they keep the motion relatively low. They use bright colors because Microsoft's color palette is varied and bright. But they've achieved a very great effect. And in a way, they're supporting the same end goal, but they've used a really different digital approach to do it. And I think the lesson there is that, and this is kind of back to the question of the hang and bang, which is what is the end goal? Why are we doing this? Matters a lot. And what are we doing is just a means to why are we doing it. And although that sounds obvious, that's really where I think a lot of projects get hung up on is the distance between what are we doing and why are we doing it, and have we stayed true to that vision as we evolve, as things evolve. Another example from New York City. So this is in the PATH station. So under the World Trade Center, there is a long hallway that you walk through. There's a 280-foot video wall with primarily advertising running on it. There's a small segment near the entrance you can see in the distance to the lower right corner that's effectively content continuous. It's spatially discontinuous with the video wall. I have some video of it so we can watch it play. So, this is an insane amount of digital space to work with, and yet they're able to keep the content in check in terms of not being too brassy, too loud, too sort of visually violent, and able to create an experience which, even though the screen is large, remains at a human scale. So there's some playfulness in the ads. There's a segment that came before that'll come again where there are figures that are walking. Here we are, and they're walking at roughly human speed. And it's actually quite cool to walk and realize all these digital people are walking at your pace, and they look like they're probably a little taller than a normal person, but they look sort of aesthetically like they're the same size. And so I think the lesson here is, and this will become increasing importance as we paint such large digital surfaces, can we keep the humanity of the digital, or are we going to be tempted to do more primitive things and sort of drub people over the head? And I think that's the danger there. And the example that this shows very well, that in spite of the fact that they're working with multiple advertisers, that they're able to curate the content so that what you see is good and proportionate to the space and not proportionate to the size of the digital display, which would make it way out of whack for the space. So one last example, so this is also not Scala. One last example that's also not Scala is all this great stuff, and yet in 2017, we still see problems. So this was taken not too far from where I live, and I mean, we all have our, anyone in this industry has taken shots of different signage failures. This is one of my favorites. So let's sort of park those examples for a bit and talk. Hopefully I have a few more minutes. I just went red on the screen. But what does the future look like? Now first, there are a couple of things. So Niels Bohr said, prediction is very difficult, especially if it's about the future. And that sounds a little glib, but I think what the real point there is that we need to be humble in our prediction and open to the possibility that we're wrong. And if we're too certain of where we're going to end up on some sort of shunted line on the side of the rail yard and not where all the action is. So I think we just need to be open and cautious. And the other one is a little bit more meaty, which Bill Gates wrote. He says, we always overestimate the change that will occur in the next 2 years and underestimate the change that will occur in the next 10. And that's really interesting, and I've thought about this and rolled around in my head a few times. And I think, a big part of the answer is we get seduced by the big thing, which is now. So, we have all these terms from now and from the past 20 to 30 years, things that were going to be transformational to our industry, and we imagine these things, and everyone's going to use NFC, and everyone's going to use QR codes, everyone's going to have 3D TVs, and all these things, and we get sort of caught up in the breathlessness of something and not end up in the moment in a good position to assess the timelessness of something, and so we confuse the two. And so at the same time, all these forces march forward without stop, and that's where kind of the tenure part comes from, is that even if one of these things or all of these things are the wrong thing, change is happening, change is coming, and that's where, if you look back at some of the older examples, how far we seem to have come, and we look at things like the Raspberry Pi, how that went from a glimmer to a dream to millions of units and so on. It has to do with this unstoppable force of change, even if from today we can't look at today's hot button topic and say for sure that's the one. That being said, we're really interested, and we're not a one-minded at our company, but we're really interested in things like augmented reality because we're very interested in how the in-store experience brings you obviously the ability to touch product, and the online experience gives you the ability to dive into and explore the information behind a product. And anything that helps us connect those two really can enrich the point of going to the store and support the convenience, which is really what people are after. They're after convenience, they're after engagement. And so any way in which we could tie them together automatically becomes of interest, and we think that AR fits in that. Conversational UI, so Alexa obviously has changed the way people think about conversational UI, but in a way, a touch tone voice response system is just an earlier version of the same thing, and so it's less about the voice technology in some ways than it is about the fact that for thousands of years humans have conversed, they've asked each other questions, they've interrupted each other and supported each other. It's a pretty natural way of transacting, and a lot of what we do in signage is supporting transactions, so naturally that becomes part of it. And where the voice comes in, of course, is makes it that much easier and decouples you from sort of proximity to a device. So what does the future look like, and do I really want to know? So here are 3 frightening pictures. On the upper right is an abandoned shopping mall, of which there are many, many, many examples. The lower left is a map of sort of the south half of Manhattan, and every red dot is a vacancy, commercial vacancy for retail. And then the depressing bar graph is retail stores. It's fairly US-centric, but basic idea, the number of things that are closing in early 2017. So if you're thinking about the future of signage and the future of retail, it's a risky business to be making guesses. That being said, a lot of these forces, some of this is obviously online e-commerce, and that's not going away. Some of it's cyclical, some of it's past overinvestment, some of it's economics, some of it's changes in buying habits that are not fully baked out yet. That being said, people still meet in places, they still want experiences, they still want to connect, and so whatever proportion of our landscape will be retail or will be something else, there will be opportunities to do great things to support those encounters digitally. So from a retail or venue point of view, I sort of think of it that there's 3 waves of interest. The first is the store of the future, the venue of the future, and these are these great one-ofs that it's like the Comcast Center, where really you throw all the best thinking and all the best design at it, and the goal isn't really to make it replicable, the goal is really to amaze and wow. And a lot of great work can be done there. They're very high on design. You need very sophisticated design and architects and visionaries to make that happen. There's another level, which is kind of, for lack of a better term, I call a flagship venue or flagship store. And here we're talking about experiences that can be replicated, but because of space and cost and other reasons, you might see 3 or 5 or 20 of them. And so again, the emphasis is going to be on rich, engaging experiences where you can devote a lot of thought, a lot of real estate to, a lot of space to. But the truth is, most non-online business happens in regular towns and regular suburbs, and so we call that the store of the now, which is how much commerce is happening at places that can't afford to have ginormous screens and all this other technology. And so in those spaces, we can take advantage of interactive technologies and endless aisle technologies and data integration and affordability of hardware and really make a difference in sort of kind of ordinary experiences that people have in stores without it being necessarily a destination event. And so there's a lot of great things that can be done there. So I'm on the last section now. So this is something I found which is really interesting. This is a project called, I lost the name now. It is called Diapoly Écran. It was 50 years ago at the World's Fair in Montreal. So this is 112 cubes with slide projectors in them. It's an 11-minute presentation on the history of mankind in the world. It had 15,000 slides, and the cubes themselves moved backwards and forwards, and there was something like 240 miles of cables to power this, and 750,000 analog instructions to make this all come together. So why do I bring that up? So this is an extraordinarily complex amount of stuff behind the screens, which creates a fantastic, in this case, never seen before impact to the viewers that were sitting on the floor in this particular scenario at a destination venue. And I think the point is that in the future, because of ubiquity, anything, any surface, any space can be painted. And one takeaway from that is, not everything should be, but we are headed towards a kind of universal canvas where in thin air, so I saw this thing about laser projection which projected in air, and they're actually able to do 8 cubic millimeters now. So it's no screen, but it's 3D, hanging in space. Okay, it's a little tiny, so it's still in the lab, but you know it's coming in some way, shape, or form. So we'll have all this canvas, and what are we to do with it? And the answer is to help make meaningful connections. And the most important meaningful connection is person to person, people to people, but also people to knowledge, people to discovery, people to information, people to art and creativity, and people to brand, and yes, people to product. And so the magic and the magicians that will always be needed to use this ubiquitous canvas to create those connections between people and the things that they interact with. Thank you.